On December 23, 1835, 110 soldiers under Major Francis Dade departed from Fort Brooke in present-day Tampa Bay, Florida. Fort Brooke was established in 1823 by the United States Army to bring a military presence into the Tampa Bay area, mainly to control the Seminole Indians after a recent signing of the Treaty of Moultrie Creek. Yeah, basically, mainly to control the Seminoles is, that reason is to keep them on the reservation, keep them from getting to the coastline where most of the inhabitants were. Fort Brooke was a wooden log fort with support buildings. The men had it very rough, having to build the forts during the Seminole Wars from the surrounding trees, along with numerous diseases, rampant sickness, and extreme Florida heat, only made worse by the uniforms made from wool. On a lot of different campaigns, they had to, I've read this before, that they actually shipped all the stuff to make the forts with them. Certain places out west and everything where there was like barely any trees, they shipped the logs, they cut them in the northeast, shipped them all the way out west wherever they needed to go. But down here, the soldiers had to work with what they had. They had to cut down trees, they had to use hay bales, mud bricks, whatever they could get their hands on to make these forts. They had to use what they had on the land. Almost constantly being soaking wet from extreme humidity, constant rain showers, and marching through swampland all day. The life of a Seminole War soldier was not easy. Yeah, you don't say. Understatement of the year, maybe? A horrible, horrible post to be put. Now on December 23rd, 1835, the Second Seminole War had not started yet, and Major Dade and his 110 men marched out of the gates at Fort Brooke. They had no idea that in just 4 days, only 3 would survive an attack. The time building up to the massacre, the U.S. spent it trying to forcibly relocate the Seminole Indians out west, as they had done to nearly every other Native American tribe they encountered under expansionism out west. Starting on May 28, 1830, the Indian Removal Act was passed by Congress to begin forcibly relocation of thousands of Native Americans to reservations out west. The Treaty of 1823 had resulted in reducing their land to 4 million acres in central Florida with no access to the ocean. Following another treaty of Payne's Landing, it called for the Seminoles to move west of the Mississippi to current-day Oklahoma within 3 years. The treaty also included leaving behind all African Americans that had been absorbed into the Seminole tribes. Now here's the thing. Seminoles is kind of our bastardized name, I guess, what you call it. I don't believe that they called themselves Seminoles. It's another name for renegade, is from what I was reading. And it's basically the absorption of the Creek Indians that were up in the Georgia, Alabama area. They got pushed down here by Andrew Jackson and the Creek and First Seminole Wars. The Creek Indians were pushed down to the Panhandle, down into Florida, and kind of spread out, along with runaway slaves from the whole time, from when we were a British colony until we became the United States of America. A delegation of Seminole leaders went to see the lands out west, and when they returned in 1833, the Treaty of Fort Gibson was put on the table to be signed, and with some coercion, the treaty was signed, and later the Seminoles denied that they had agreed to move out west. And in 1834, General Wiley Thompson was put in charge to oversee the removal of the Seminoles. He became the Seminole Indian agent down here, which was right next to Fort King and Ocala. This led the leaders of the Seminole Indians to resist the Americans at all costs. Yeah, you don't say. Which brings us back to December 23rd, 1835, with Chief Micanopy. I always call it Micanopy. There's a town named after him to this day that I call Micanopy, but I think it's Micanopy. We'll say Micanopy. Chief Micanopy and Osceola were two of the main Indian leaders for the attack planned against Major Dade and his men. Chief Micanopy laid in wait for Major Dade while Osceola was outside of Fort King, waiting to get vengeance on Wiley Thompson. Major Dade and his men were on their way to Fort King in present-day Ocala, Florida, to resupply and reinforce the fort. Everything was going smooth, and on their journey, 5 days had passed without much happening. 5 days. It took them 5 days to get halfway from Tampa Bay to Ocala. So Fort Brooke to Fort King, not a very long distance. It's, if I had to guess, it'd be about 40 miles, 50 miles, something like that. On the morning of December 28, 1835, a light rain started. The temperature was in the mid-40s. Major Dade gave the order for the soldiers to put their rifles under their coats to keep their powder dry. This order does kind of make sense because muskets had not changed very much in the past like 200-300 years leading up to the 1830s. They were still fired with a rock. A piece of flint had to strike a piece of steel to make a spark. They hadn't had percussion caps. They didn't have cartridges or anything like this at this point. They had to stick a bullet down the barrel, ram it home with powder, and they had to open a pan, put powder in the pan, close the pan, and they had to use the hammer, cock it back with a piece of flint on it, and when they fired, that flint struck a steel pan and ignited that, which ignited the powder in the rifle or the musket and exploded it out. The powder needed to be dry to ignite, and after 5 days of nothing happening, Major Dade was relaxed enough to give the order to the men to keep their rifles under their coats. Chief Micanopy and an estimated 180 Seminole warriors had been shadowing the two companies led by Major Dade. The soldiers had crossed rivers and thick woods on previous days traveled. The Seminoles usually attacked during river crossings or when they were covered by thick woods. Major Dade thought they had passed the danger and told his men, "We have now gotten through the danger. Keep up good heart, and when we reach Fort King, I will give you 3 days off for Christmas." The Seminoles had been waiting for Osceola to join them for the battle with Major Dade, but that same day, Osceola is at Fort King. Wiley Thompson and Lieutenant Constantine Smith. Constantine. When's the last time you heard that name? No offense if your name is Constantine, but you don't hear that every day. Or outside of the fort's walls on the afternoon of the 28th. When Osceola attacks, Wiley Thompson is shot 14 times. He is scalped, and 4 others are killed, including Lieutenant Constantine Smith. And that is the reason Osceola is not with Micanopy. Chief Micanopy and the 180 Seminole warriors stalking Major Dade and his men. As Major Dade tells his men he will give his men 3 days off for Christmas, almost simultaneously, a shot rings out. Chief Micanopy and his men cannot wait for Osceola any longer. Chief Micanopy fired that shot after Major Dade gave his speech to his men. That shot was the prearranged signal to start the attack. The first volley of fire brought down Major Dade and half of his men. The Seminoles had the element of surprise. The attack began at 8 a.m. The soldiers were in 2 single-file lines. Many were killed immediately. Few men were able to retrieve their muskets from under their woolen coats. Private Ransom Clark, I believe he's a private, and it's a hell of a name, Ransom, another name I haven't heard. Ransom Clark escaped the battle and returned to Fort Brooke. This is what he said about the battle. First person account here, Private Ransom Clark. After the shot from the front of the column, a volley was poured upon from the front and left flank. Half of the command went down. Several volleys had been fired before he could see any enemy. After a few volleys, the enemy looms in the distance, but only their heads and arms from out of the tall grass, and from behind pine trees only. The men threw themselves behind trees and opened a sharp fire of musketry. Lieutenant Basinger fired 6 or 7 6-pounders. Alright, a 6-pounder to to give some clarity here, is a term with the cannonballs. They had a solid shot cannonball, and 6-pounder is not referred to the gun, it's actually referred to the size of the shot. So a 6-pound musket ball they were shooting. It was a cannon artillery piece that fired 6-pound solid shots at the enemy. The 6-pounder, which did little damage but frightened the Indians into withdrawing over a hill. During a lull in the fighting, some men gathered ammunition and assisted with the wounded. Others fell large pine trees. From the logs of the pine, they constructed a crude breastworks 3 logs deep on the main wall of the west, and the northern and the southern walls converging towards the trail and the pond in a triangular form. So they built a triangular breastworks with logs, so they had a place to hide. They were in the middle of basically an open field, and the Indians were around the perimeter with the trees. They had raised it barely knee-high when the enemy returned to attack, spreading themselves from tree to tree, surrounding the soldiers within a long musket shot, opening a brisk fire from cannon and musketry. By 2 o'clock, after 5 hours of steady fighting, 3/4 of an hour in between the first and second attack, all had been cut down. Captain Gardner was severely wounded at the end of the battle, and he cried out, quote, "I can give you no more orders, my lads. Do your best." Imagine that. Everyone's dead around you. There's very few men left. You're like the last high up person there, captain. Everybody else is dead. The first volley knocked out basically 50 of the people. So you're the last man. Captain comes up.
"I can give you no more orders, my lad. Do your best."
It's like out of a movie. As Captain Gardner cried out, Lieutenant Basinger, severely wounded, told Clark, and this is his, Clark, that's him, told Clark to lie down and pretend himself to be dead. So, apparently from Clark, Lieutenant Basinger, the one that was firing off the 6-pounders, told him to lay down and pretend that he's dead. With none left to resist, the Indians charged into the works, either believing all dead or unwilling to crown their victory with cold-blooded butchery, stepped about carefully and quietly, removing arms and accoutrement. Believing all to be dead or unwilling to crown their victory with cold-blooded butchery. I think what he's saying there is they didn't scalp anybody. We all know about Native Americans. That was kind of what they did. They scalped. That was how they fought. But this time they did not. Not all of them. I'm saying not every Native American tribe was going around scalping people, but the Seminoles were known for that some of the time, along with like Apaches and some other Native American. A lot of soldiers got scalped back in the day, a lot of travelers. But at this time, they did not. No cold-blooded butchery here. And they stepped about carefully and quietly, removing arms and accoutrement. So they were basically after weapons and anything else they could get their hands on to help them with the battle that they knew was coming, because, oh, they just started a war. Well, we kind of started the war. They initiated it. And without offering indignity, retired in the direction that they had came. This is the best account we have for the battle from the American side. He escaped, and he survived the whole battle. 3 soldiers actually had survived the battle. Private Edward DeCourcy. DeCourcy? I think it's DeCourcy. Was covered by bodies and escaped with Ransom Clark, the gentleman we just got that account from. The next day, a Seminole pursued them on horseback. They split up to avoid being captured together, and Private DeCourcy was killed. Damn, that sucks. Imagine you and 118 buddies trumping through the forest. Everybody gets killed except you and one other person that you know of. I know there's another one that survived, but they didn't know that. They think it's just them, those 2. And there is hundreds of Indians around, 180 versus them. There was more Indians to soldiers at the beginning of the battle, and now there's 2 of you. And they don't know it, but only 5 Indians are dead. So there is 175 Indians left to come after him.
Oh, I'd be shaking in my boots. Oh.
Private Joseph Sprague also escaped the battle. He was assigned to Company B, 3rd Artillery. He arrived at Fort Brooke on New Year's Day with a wound in his arm. So, it only took him 3 days to get back. Oh yeah. So it took him 5 days to get to that point. The massacre happened. He gets shot in the arm, and he books it back so fast, it only took him 3 days to get back. I know the soldiers, they go pretty slow back in the day. They got horses, they got wagons, because they were doing a supply mission, basically. That's the reason they were going to Fort King, to resupply him. So they're carrying stuff with them. That's probably why it took them so long, because the roads back in the day, and they're not roads today. They're basically mud and dirt and rock where they can, and they have to ford over rivers. And if they do have bridges, they're made out of chintzy wood that they built. Either wood or rock, whatever they could get their hands on to get through all the rivers. He was illiterate and did not leave a report from the battle. But there was one last survivor from the battle. Major Dade's personal interpreter and also his personal slave, Luis Pacheco. He was Major Dade's interpreter. He resurfaced in 1837, 2 whole years later. He said that he was scouting ahead of the column and was taken prisoner by the Seminoles, but he was not believed. Yeah, I bet you they didn't believe him. But who knows? He probably was, because in that position, you're the slave for a major. I know you'd want him, but why did he come back? He came back 2 years later, so I can't believe that he actually... Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think he came back. They thought he was the informant to the Indians, deciding the best time to strike. Yeah. I don't think that. Because 2 years later, he comes back to the soldiers, you know. Oh my God, I've been captured by the Indians. The whole massacre happened. Major Dade, oh, everybody's dead. I can't imagine that happening. If he wanted to be the informant and get everybody killed, why would he go back to the military camp later? That doesn't make sense. But they sure thought that he did. Because they shipped him out west with the Indians that they had captured. They were shipping off Indians. Every time they captured them, they'd ship them off to Oklahoma, you know. So he got shipped off with the batch out to Oklahoma. And he returned once again, though, shortly before his death in 1895. Another account was from a Seminole leader named Alligator. That's a heck of a name. Now this is quotes here. Quote unquote. We had been preparing for more than a year. Just as the day was breaking, we moved out of the swamp and into the pine. I counted, by direction of Jumper, 180 warriors upon approaching the road. Each man chose his position on the west side. So Jumper must be above him, since Jumper told him to count the men and he counted 180. So Jumper's probably next in line, and then maybe Micanopy. I don't know. About 9 o'clock in the morning, the command approached. So soon, all the soldiers were opposite. Jumper gave a whoop. Whoop! Micanopy fired the first shot. The signal agreed upon when every Indian arose and fired, which laid upon the ground dead more than half of the white men. The cannon was discharged several times, but the men who loaded it were shot down as soon as the smoke cleared away. As we returned to the swamp, supposing all were dead, an Indian came up and said white men were building a fort of logs. Jumper and myself with 10 other warriors returned. As we approached, we saw 6 men behind logs placed one another, with a cannon a short distance off. So soldiers were making that triangle fort, putting logs on top of one another, trying to get a little bit of a little bit of cover fire from the Indians. They were trying to cover themselves so they weren't completely open to being brutally murdered by a complete surrounding of Native Americans. We soon came near as the balls went over us. When they're saying balls, they're talking about musket balls firing over their heads. They had guns but no powder. We looked into the boxes after and found all were empty. Pretty sure they probably had ammunition and other stuff in them boxes. If they finally got in after 5 hours of fighting and saw that the boxes were empty, it doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't anything in there. They could have been full of ammo or full of powder or full of something, you know, rations, who knows. They could have either gotten rid of it or used it all. But yeah, when Alligator comes up, he sees the boxes are empty, so he assumes that they were empty all along and they didn't have any ammunition. The firing had ceased and all was quiet. When we returned to the swamp around noon, 3 warriors were killed and 5 wounded." End quote. After the battle, several large plantations were burned and numerous settlers killed. News made it back to Washington, D.C. to President Andrew Jackson, who was the general in the First Seminole War. Andrew Jackson's campaign into Spanish Florida to take over forts and towns, fight Seminole villages, ultimately caused the Spanish' willingness to sell Florida to the United States, ending the long Spanish rule of Florida. The Spanish had owned Florida for a very, very long time, from the 1500s. Just a short period where all of Florida was not owned by Spain. But Andrew Jackson came in at around the beginning of the turn of the century, in the early 1800s, after the War of 1812. And he came down, he was fighting the Creek Indians along Georgia and Alabama, from like Tennessee came down. And he basically conquered all of Florida with barely any men. Started the war, and he completely took over Florida for the Americans. And now, it was under the president's order, but the president had plausible deniability in case anything happened. So he kind of gave him vague answers and let Andrew Jackson do what Andrew Jackson does best. An article from the 27th of January, 1836, in the National Intelligencer reads, "From Florida, we are indebted to the politeness of a friend for the subjoined extract of a letter from a gentleman attached to Major Mountfort's command in Florida." Oh, old-timey writing is hard to read and understand. It furnishes a more particular account of the distressing and awful situation of the inhabitants of a part of that devoted territory. Quote, "Fort Brooke, Florida, January 1st, 1836. Through the interposition of Providence, I am now alive to let you know we are really in the theater of war of the most horrible kind. We arrived here on Christmas Day and found the inhabitants flying in from all quarters to camp. Major Dade, with 7 officers and 100 men, started the day before we arrived for Fort King. We were all prepared to overtake them the next day, and we were upon the eve of departure when an intervention of circumstances deferred it for 1 day. In the course of that day, 3 soldiers horribly mangled came into camp and brought the melancholy tidings. Major Dade and every officer and man except themselves were murdered and terribly mangled. We are at work night and day, entrenching ourselves in every possible manner. We expect every moment to be attacked. As the savages have sworn, we should be all massacred before the 6th of January. We are only about 200 strong, with officers and men, and about 50 citizens and 100 friendly Indians. With their chief, Black Dirt, the savages are said to number 4,000. I am in Major Mountfort's private room, now waiting to keep sharp lookout, so as to retreat at a moment's warning. We hope to receive a reinforcement when our situation is known. Officers and men are like brothers, encouraging each other and determined with their last breath to avenge their fallen comrades. If the Indians come upon us in small bodies, say 500 or 600, I am sure that we will beat them off. I am at Major M's quarters all day, but at my post at night." Unquote. The battle ended with 108 U.S. soldiers killed and 1 wounded. 1 was untouched. Along with the attack at Fort King from Osceola, leaving Wiley Thompson and 4 others dead. Don't forget about good old Constantine. Can't forget Constantine. This is the spark that started the Second Seminole War. The soldiers were buried at the battle until the end of the Second Seminole War, and in 1842 they were disinterred and buried in the St. Augustine National Cemetery at St. Francis Barracks, under 3 coquina stone pyramids with 1,300 other soldiers who died in the Second Seminole War. This was not the first or the last Seminole War. There were 3 altogether. It was the longest and most expensive Indian war, costing about $30 million, equivalent to over $1,031 million in today's currency. $1 billion. Oh my word, that's a hell of a lot of money. The Seminole Indians were moved out west except for a small band of Indians, around 100, who escaped into the Florida Everglades, but probably more of them survived. So about 100, probably more. The completion of the Micanopy Trail in 1928, which bisected the Everglades, finally ended the old ways of life for the Seminole people. The Seminoles began working on farms and ranches in the newly developed areas of South Florida. It is debated that the Seminole Wars were the first war that the U.S. had lost. Some Seminoles escaped and remained in Florida to this day. The wars were devastating to the Seminole people. Most were shipped off to present-day Oklahoma, and countless others died in the campaigns. And that's the story of the Dade Massacre, people. Very frightening and chilling. There's some other details in there, and some of the accounts that I left out that were a little too brutal. But if you want to learn about it, you can read about it. I did research over the past couple of days from numerous newspapers, articles, all over the place, some books, to write this script for this video. So I hope you enjoyed. We haven't really done anything like this before, but if you liked it, leave a comment. If you want more about history and other different things, leave a comment down below. Comments, criticisms, anything you got. Alright folks, I hope you all enjoyed this video. I had fun making it. I had a blast learning about all the history, doing all the research, writing the script. Oh, my wrist is tired. I haven't written that long in a long time. Thank you for watching. We'll see you on the next. Peace.